Boker Tov. Today's daf yomi is Nedarim daf Nun Dal and Nedarim 54. We're going to start on the top of Nun Dal Amud Aleph at the Mishnah in the beginning of the new chapter, the seventh chapter. Hanoder min hayerek, one who takes a vow away from yerek. Yerek we can translate in modern Hebrew, we translate as vegetables, but really the Talmud here means greens. The Ran says that this is something that's typically eaten raw, unlike delulium, which is gourds, which is squash, which we typically would have to cook in order to eat. So I know they're minayerek. So if a person takes a vow that they're not going to eat greens, and under those circumstances, we're going to say mutar b'delulium. We're going to allow them to eat squash. We're going to say that the vow against the greens does not include within it the category of delulium, of squash. Whereas Rabbi Akiva says, no, the vow does typically include the category of squash. If you take a vow against yerek, it does include squash within it, or gourds. So Amrlo Rabbi Akiva, so the Chachamim said to Rabbi Akiva, a person will typically say to their agent, to their person they send to the store, yerek, go buy for me some yerek. And the agent will say, lo matzasi ela delulium. The agent will say, listen, I only found squash. So this proves that it's a totally different category, because if it was the same category, he would come back and say, yeah, I found this. But he's saying, I didn't find this. I only found this. This means it's a completely different category. So Amar Lahem, so Rabbi Akiva responded, indeed, you just proved my point. Kain Adavar, you just proved my point. Oh, Shema Omer Hu Lo Matzasi Ela Kitnios. He doesn't say, listen, I didn't find greens, but I found beans. Well, there's still, obviously, beans is completely different. Kitnios, legumes, they're completely different than greens. It's just that if you say greens, you include within it squash. The kinios ain't a baklal yerek, and the beans are not included within the category of yerek. So basically, if you translate yerek as a vegetable, you would include within it this concept of squash within the concept of quote unquote vegetables, but you wouldn't include a legume, a bean. If you take a vow against yerek, we're going to say that the fresh pul hamitzri is an Egyptian bean, but if it was in its fresh state, they would eat the leaves, and so therefore you're going to include the pul hamitzri lach within the category of yerek. Well, but you wouldn't include the yavesh, the dry one, because then you're not eating the greens. You're eating the kernel or the berry or the bean itself. So we see from here is a dispute between Tanakama and Rabbi Akiva. If you take a vow against yerek, whether or not you're including squash within that vow. The Chachamim say you are not, and Rabbi Akiva says you are. The Gemara says, but why does Rabbi Akiva say that you're including squash? Yerek, no, you just take the vow against yerek. Why does that include squash? It's greens, not squash. Amar Ula ba Omer Yarke Kadera Alai. So you didn't say yerek, just plain yerek. You said yarke kadera, anything that's cooked, any greens that's cooked in a pot, and this would include the squash, because the gourds are typically cooked in a pot. Gemara says v'dilma, maybe it means yerek hanechal b'kadera ka'amar. So maybe what she states, the yarke kadera lai, it just means those greens that are just eaten in the pot, like for example onions and garlic, that they're eaten in a pot, that you put them into a pot in order to give spices. Maybe that's all you're referring to if say yarke kadera. Why would we assume that yarke kadera refers to squash? Maybe it just maybe it's just a reference to those vegetables that you add to the pot for spices. That's what the Gemara says. So the Gemara answers, no, but Omer Yerek Hamispasha there. All you said was the greens that are typically, or the vegetables that are typically cooked in a pot, and that includes squash within it, and not therefore you're not just saying yerek, but you're also including the vegetables that you need to cook in order to eat, and that would be a reference to gourds. So what's the nature of the dispute between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Akiva, where the Rabbanan say that if you say yerek, it does not include squash, whereas Rabbi Akiva says it does. So the Rabbanan Savri, Kol Milsa Ditzarach Shlicha Lamuche Allah Lav Minehu. The Rabbanan say anything that the agent needs to come back and ask about it, that clearly was the case, that it was not part of the initial understanding of the words. Otherwise, the agent wouldn't have need to ask about it. Whereas Rabbi Akiva Sever, Kol Milsa de Mimlach Shlicha Allah Minehu. Whereas Rabbi Akiva's other position, everything which the agent needs to ask is a sign that it's in the same category. From the fact that he asked about it, it shows it's within that category. And Amar Abaye, Moda Rabbi Akiva, Le'inya Malkos She'eno Loke. So as Rabbi Akiva says, so Abaye says that even though Rabbi Akiva says that if you take the vow against Yerek, it includes within it squash, nevertheless, Rabbi Akiva himself would admit, with respect to lashes, that you don't get lashes under this category. And what's the reason he says you don't get lashes under this category? Because he's going to say that it's not a certainty, it's not a certainty. So therefore, he's going to admit that you wouldn't get lashes, because you're not going to get lashes for violating the prohibition of violating a vow, because Rabbi Akiva only says that the squash is prohibited because he says it's clear that this person intended to it, but he doesn't say that. He doesn't say it's clear. He just says it's a doubt, and since it's a doubt, we're going to say that you can't do it, and we're not going to give you lashes in a situation where it's a doubt. So the Gemara says, since we're talking about cases where we want to know if the agency is definitely a case of continuing over. If the agent is continuing over the intentions of the Baal Bias is really what we're saying here is the one who asked him to do the agency. The Gemara is going to bring a Mishnah from Me'ilah. The Rambam says that there's only one case where a person who is an agent, generally speaking, we have a case called Ein Shliach Dvar Avera, that there can be no agency for sin. That if Reuven asked Shimon to do a sin for him, let's say that Shimon is the one who's responsible, not Reuven. But the Rambam says the one exception to this rule is called Me'ilah. Other Rishonim say there are actually 3 exceptions to the rule, but and everyone is bothered by the Rambam only says 1. But the one that everybody agrees is an exception to this rule is the case of Me'ilah. Me'ilah is, typically speaking, we're typically translated as misappropriation of temple property. That if the Beis HaMikdash has something and it's hekdesh, you're not allowed to use it. If you use it intentionally, you misappropriate intentionally, you're going to get kares. But if you misappropriate it accidentally, then it's called Me'ilah. You have to bring a carbon asham, Me'ilah, and you also have to pay back the temple plus 1/5. So typically we say that if you ask an agent to do something and the agent does it, the agent is the one who's responsible. When it comes to Me'ilah, we say that the Baal Bias, the one who asked the agent to do it, is the one who's responsible. The Mishnah is going to discuss the parameters of that here. Tanan Hasam, so the Mishnah Me'ilah stated, Hashliach she'asa shlichu, so that if an agent does his agency, Baal Bias Mal, that an agent who does his agency, that if let's say you have a piece of meat, which is temples, and you forgot that it's the temples, and you tell the agent, go take this and serve it to my guests, then the Baal Bias is responsible and not the agent. But if the agent deviates, so then Shliach Mal, if the agent deviates partially from the request, then the agent is the one who's responsible, not the Baal Bias. So Mantana. So therefore, we're saying who says this teaching? So Amar Rav Chisda Masnisen Delo Rabbi Akiva, the author of this mission that says if the agent deviates, he's not responsible. That is going to be not like the position of Rabbi Akiva. The Tanan, because we learned that. What did we say in the Mishnah Me'ila? Ketzad, what's an example of how this operates? Amar, well, let's say the Baal Abayis says to the agent, Tain basar la'orchem, give meat to the guests, v'nasan lahem kaved, and the agent gave them, instead of meat, he gave them liver. Or if he says, Tain kaved, let's say he says, give liver, v'nasan lahem basar, and then what does he do? He gives to them meat. Hashliach mal. Then under these circumstances, we're going to say that the agent has done something wrong. He's misappropriated. V'i Rabbi Akiva, but didn't we just say that Rabbi Akiva said above in our Mishnah that if the agent asks about it, that it's considered to be within that category? Rabbi Akiva called Melsa de Shliach Mineu. But doesn't Rabbi Akiva say that any case where the agent would need to ask, it's going to be considered like it was within this category? So therefore, in this case, we should say that the Baal Abayis is the one who trespassed. If he says, I send you to the market for meat, and then the agent gives liver, he says, I couldn't find meat, I find liver, we would say it's included within that category. So Rabbi Akiva should say, therefore, that in this case, too, it's included within that category. And therefore, in this case, the Baal Abayis should be the one who's trespassing and not the agent. So therefore, that's what we should say. So Amar Abaye says, no, afilu te'ema Rabbi Akiva. You could even say, in this case, that this Mishnah that says, in Me'ila, where if you say, serve meat, and the guy goes and serves liver, that the agent is liable and not the Baal Abayis, you could say that this is not necessarily in conflict with Rabbi Akiva's position, because Rabbi Akiva will say you actually need to ask. In this case, the Baal Abayis, the agent didn't ask. He just went ahead and served the liver. If he had asked and said, "Can I serve the liver?" then Rabbi Akiva would say, "Of course, that's the Baal Abayis should be the one who's responsible, because the Baal Abayis came back and asked." But the Baal Abayis didn't ask in this case. I mean, the Shliach didn't ask in this case. So clearly, it's a case where the Shliach went rogue. He didn't ask, and so therefore the Shliach was responsible, not the Baal Abayis. We're on the top of 54b. In Mar Shmaita Kamei de Rava, Amarlon Shapir Amar Nachmani. So they said this teaching that Abaye of Abaye in front of Rava, where Abaye says that even Rabbi Akiva would agree in this case. And they said this teaching in front of Rava. So when they said that, Rava responded that Nachmani said properly. Who is Nachmani? Nachmani is Abaye. Why is he called Nachmani? There's a couple of different approaches. So the Ran says that since Abaye was raised in the house of Rabba Bar Nachmani, Abaye was an orphan. We know from other sources in the Gemara, Amrli Aim, that he was raised by his nurse, that he was adopted, but he was also raised in the house of Rabba Bar Nachmani. And so since he was raised in that house, they called Abaye Nachmani. Basically they gave him that last name of Nachmani. And that's what Rashi also writes in Maseches Gittin, that since Rabba Bar Nachmani raised him and taught him Torah, they called him after Rabba Bar Nachmani's father, whose name was Nachmani. However, the Aruch writes in the name of the Gaonim that just the opposite, that his real name, Abaye's real name, was Nachmani. But since Abaye was the student of Rabba Bar Nachmani, and since they called Abaye Nachmani, it would be like calling him by his father's name. So therefore, Rabba didn't want to call him Nachmani because he didn't want to call him by his father's name. So therefore, he called him Abaye in Aramaic, which is Avi, my father. And so therefore, since Abaye, so therefore, that's the opposite. So here, Rabba calls him Nachmani because Rabba Bar Nachmani doesn't want to do it, but Rabba could do it. So therefore, anyway, that's that sugya that. So we were saying here that Abaye says, even though Rabbi Akiva says kol milsa, anything that the shliach would ask about it, that even though he says kol milsa the shliach mineu, and anything that the shliach, that the agent would ask, is from that category. That's with respect to Nedarim. But with respect to Me'ila, if the agent doesn't actually ask, it's not going to be considered like Me'ila because it's considered like he went rogue under those circumstances. So the Gemara says, "Oman Tanan de Pagalei de Rabbi Akiva." Who's the one who argues with Rabbi Akiva? Again, Rabbi Akiva says that if you take a vow against Yerek, it includes Deluyim, because the agent would say, I didn't find Yerek, but I did find Deluyim. And he says anything the agent would ask about is included within that category. But the Chachamim say it's permitted. Who are the Chachamim here who argue with Rabbi Akiva? Montana. Who is the one who argues with him? So the Gemara explained that this is the position of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. The Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Anoder min habasar. Somebody takes a vow against meat. Aser b'kol minei basar. That if somebody takes a vow that they're not going to eat meat, they're prohibited to eat any types of meat. Ba'aser b'rosh u'b'raglayim, and they're prohibited to eat the head of the animal and the legs of the animal. Uvekana, and the kana is the pipe of the animal, the trachea. That's also going to be prohibited. Uvekaved. And you're not allowed to eat the liver, ubalev, uva ophos. And if you take a vow that you're not going to eat meat, you're not allowed. It also includes the head, the legs, the kana, the liver, the heart, and birds, chicken. Because all these things, the agent would say, "Oh, I didn't find a brisket in the store, but I did find you a piece of liver. I did find you a chicken." And such a person is allowed to eat quote unquote meat of fish and locusts, that those are not going to be considered meat. The rest of Shimon Gamliel says, Hanoder ben Abasar, Aser b'kol minei basar. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says that if somebody takes a vow that I'm not going to eat meat, well, such a person is not going to be allowed to eat any meat, Aser b'kol minei basar, and he's not going to be allowed to eat any meat, but he is going to be allowed to eat mutar b'rosh, b'raglayim, kana b'kavad, u'v'lev, u'v'ofos. But he is allowed to eat these like subcategories of meat, which are not typically going to be included. If you tell a person, if you tell your agent, go to the store to get me a piece of meat, he's not going to typically buy you the head of the meat or the legs or the liver or the heart without first asking you, or chicken. So Rabbi Shimon Gamliel say if you take this vow, you're allowed to eat these different kinds of meat, and you're also allowed to eat fish and chicken. So Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is the author of our Mishnah, says the Gemara, because just like if you take a vow against vegetables, you're allowed to eat squash, so too if you take a vow against meat, you're allowed to eat the chicken, the liver, and the other parts of the meat. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer, and also Rabbi Shimon Gamliel taught Kiravayim lav basar, the intestines of the animal, that's not also within the category of meat. And somebody who eats them, they're not a human being. What does that mean? The Gemara says that what does it mean that somebody who eats the insides of the animal is not considered a person? Meaning to say that somebody who acquires them with respect to eating is somebody who acquires meat. Meaning to say, even though you could buy regular meat, you could buy them. Lav bar inish. This person is not acting like a regular person. He's a boor. He's a boor. So why do we care what this person is called? So maybe it's teaching us that you shouldn't do this, so you're not considered like a boor. But the Gemara doesn't say explicitly why do we care. Or it's possible if you have a contract, you say I'm going to, like elsewhere in the Gemara it says that if you buy a piece, you say I'm buying 100 pounds of meat, and the guy gives you the intestines, you're saying that wasn't within the category, the contract, and maybe that wasn't included in it. So that's possibly one of the reasons. So the Gemara says Ma'ishna basar oaf v'tanakama da asir. So the Gemara says, according to the Tanakama of this mission, of this Brisa, who argues with Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, who says, the Tanakama says that if you take a vow against meat, it includes within a chicken, whereas Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says it doesn't. Why does the Tanakama say that if you take a vow against meat, it includes chicken? It's prohibited, because that's something that the agent would ask about. So if you say, go buy me a piece of meat, he says, sorry, I don't have meat, I have chicken. So therefore the Tanakama is going to be like Rabbi Akiva here is going to say it's prohibited. But basar dagim nami, but isn't fish also the same category? If you send your agent to the store, go buy me a pound of meat. He says, listen, I don't know. He calls you up. He says, I don't have meat, but I do have a nice piece of salmon steak. Why isn't that included? Because if he's not going to find meat, he's going to change his mind, and he's going to ask the person if fish is okay. I see dug him. We toss her. We should say that fish should also be prohibited. So why does the Tanna Kama draw this distinction between chicken, which is included within the category of meat, because the agent will ask about it, but not fish, which he says is not included, even though we know that the agent will ask about fish. Amar Abaye says, no, the reason why we don't include fish within this category, typically fish would be included within the category of meat that the agent would ask about it. But what's the reason here? Because the Bryce is talking about a case, Kugon Shehikaz Dam. The Bryce is talking about a case where he's not going to ask about fish because that day was a day where the person had let his blood. Or if you were letting your blood that day, you know that you wouldn't eat fish on such a day because fish is bad for you. The Gemara understands that on the day of the Hakaza, it's bad for you to eat fish. That's like the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, Chav Tes Amid Aleph. So we see from here. So for sure he only included meat or chicken and couldn't have included fish because he let blood that day. Well, the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, he shouldn't also be allowed to eat chicken because on these circumstances, he does. If that's the case, he should be allowed to eat chicken because on the day that you let blood, you also don't eat chicken, and so therefore you take a vow against meat. We're going to say that it doesn't include within the category chicken. The Amar Shmuel, the misokar v'achal basar d'tzifra, that if a person lets blood from the shoulders and afterwards he eats chicken, parach libe k'tzifra, his heart is going to flutter. He's going to have arrhythmia in the heart, like a bird, just like a bird flutters. So too, your heart's going to flutter because the chicken is bad for you on the day that you let blood. And so therefore, we're going to say that if you take a vow on the day that you let blood, we're going to say for sure you didn't include within your vow chicken. So because it's not appropriate to eat that day. So why does the Tanna Kama say that you're prohibited in chicken if you took a vow against meat? Vitanya, and also we learned in the Brisa, ein makizin, that we're not supposed to let blood unless you have something to eat afterwards that's going to help you out. After you give blood, we give you some treats, but you can't let blood if the only things you have to eat afterwards are lo al dagim, lo ofos, lo basar maliach. You can't eat afterwards fish or chicken or salty meat because these things are bad for the body. Vitanya hikis dam, and we learned that if you do let the blood, lo yochal, that you shouldn't eat also. We lo chalav, lo gvina, lo beitim, lo shaklayim, lo ofos, lo basar maliach. That if you do eat the blood, you should not eat afterwards milk or cheese or eggs or cress, this vegetable, v'lo ofos, or chicken, v'lo basar maliach. All of these things are not helpful to the body. And so we see from both of these brises, that you don't eat chicken after you let the blood. And so if that's the case, for sure, if you take the vow on the day that you're bloodletting against meat, it shouldn't include chicken in the category. And if that's the case, why does the Tanna Kama draw this distinction between chicken that's included within the category of meat, but not fish, which is not included within the category of meat? So Gemara gives an answer, which we take that word for it. Shani ofos, the case of chicken is different. Even though chicken, typically speaking, is bad if you let blood that day, but you could fix it. You could boil it heavily. You can make it into a really very, very much boiled chicken, and then it will become permitted because. So therefore, if he takes the vow against meat, he was really including chicken because the chicken would be edible to him that day, even though he let blood if he cooked it heavily. Abaye gives a different answer. Why we say that if you take a vow against meat, it does not include fish, even though the fish, even according to Rabbi Kiva and the Tanna Kama this price, even though the fish is something that the agent would typically ask about, could go into Kaivan because we're talking about a case where his eyes were hurting him, and so therefore. Because it's talking about a case where he has a pain in his eyes, and we have a principle says Abai the dog in caution because if your eyes are hurting, fish is very, very bad for your eyes, and so therefore that was in those days. Today we don't apply the medical knowledge of the Talmud anymore, but in those days they believed that the fish were very bad for the eyes, and so therefore. We're going to say that he wouldn't have made a vow against the against the he wouldn't have made a vow against the fish because he wouldn't have eaten the fish that day. And so therefore that's the point. He made a time where his eyes were hurting him, and we're saying that fish were bad for the eyes, and so therefore presumably he wouldn't have made the vow that day. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, that we're talking about a case where his eyes are hurting him, well, for sure, achil dam. He should for sure eat the fish. Why? Shmuel says that the letters of nun samach ayin, we have a hint to the fact that this is a healing for the eye. Nuna, which is a name for the fish, samalei nayin. So the letters nun samach ayin is the hint to the fact that the fish helps the eyes. And so therefore, why does Abaye say that eating fish is bad for the eyes, and therefore he wouldn't have had in mind to exclude it from when he made a vow against meat, when we know that fish actually does help the eyes? And Gemara says, that's where Shmuel says that fish is healthy to the eyes. That's at the end of your illness. And then the fish is helpful to the eyes. And so then if he made a vow from meat on that day, he's also going to be prohibiting fish. But that which we learned in the Brisa, that one who takes a vow from meat is allowed to eat fish, that's only at the beginning of the illness, when his eyes are still hurting, because then the fish is bad for his eyes, and it's obviously the case that he only meant to vow something that he typically would have eaten on the day of his vow. So let's say to here, everybody will stop.